Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for bracing the gale winds. And welcome to Civil Disagreement, Academic Freedom, DEI, and the Future of Higher Education. I'm Eric Beerbaum, Director of the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to our discussion today. I'd like to begin by thanking our event co-sponsors, the FAS Civil Discourse Initiative and the Harvard College Intellectual Vitality Initiative. Their support has enabled us to expand this worthwhile series to a wider audience. These events began at Harvard Center for Ethics in 2019 as a new series of moderated civil disagreement discussions to bring together policy and subject experts who hold different political perspectives on urgent current events. Our goal has been to model thoughtful, reflective engagement on hard issues with the firm belief that we have much to learn from opposing perspectives. Today's entry in the series is on academic freedom and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, within higher education, which some have suggested have differing priorities. The conversation aims to better understand the panelists' different positions on these issues and the experiences, beliefs, and values that animate them. We'd like to extend a special welcome to our Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership, or ICDP Fellows. These fellows are participating from California State University, Bakersfield, Harvard University, Santa Fe College in Gainesville, Florida, Stanford University, and St. Philip's College in San Antonio, Texas. The ICDP program is committed to advancing fundamental democratic commitments to freedom of expression, equality, and agency. For the full academic year, these fellows work together across 5 campuses, building the skills needed to have hard conversations and learning how to facilitate those discussions for others. Before I turn the floor over to our guests, a few things to note. We strongly encourage you to enter questions in the Q&A feature as they occur to you. No need to wait to the end to do so. The in-person audience can access the Q&A using the QR code handed to you at the door. Our live stream audience can find the Q&A link in the description below the viewing window. Closed captioning is available within the live stream, and those in the room can access it via closed captioning QR code on your handout. And now I'm pleased to welcome our moderator and panelists. Moderator Christopher Robichaud is Senior Lecturer in Ethics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and Director of Pedagogy and Civil Disagreement at the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics. Amna Khalid is Associate Professor in the Department of History at Carleton College. She specializes in modern South Asian history, the history of medicine, and the global history of free expression. Stacy Hodkins is Professor of Law at Rutgers University, where she teaches courses on constitutional law, employment law, and she's developed an original seminar on diversity in the law. Stacy is an experienced labor and employment attorney and a diversity professional. Ilya Shapiro is Senior Fellow and Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute. Previously, he was Executive Director and Senior Lecturer at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution and Cato's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. And Jeannie Suk Gerson is the John H. Watson Jr. Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, where she teaches courses on constitutional law, family law, and criminal law. She is co-president of the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard. With that, Chris, over to you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks to audience members for coming today. Thank you, panelists, for agreeing to have this really important conversation. I'm going to jump into the questions in a minute. I did want to frame this for all of us here just very quickly in the following way. What we want today to be is a conversation, and so I really want the framing to be a conversation and not a debate. Debates are scored, time is kept, we make sure that everyone has the final word or tries to have the final word. That's a bit too formal. We want this to be a good faith conversation where we surface disagreement and lean into it where it exists. We don't run away from agreement if it happens to surface as well. So I do want our understanding of this to be a conversation. And the second thing is, this is just mostly for the audience members, is unlike some television shows or so forth, I'm not really interested in 30-second sound bites. So I want to give folks an opportunity to elaborate on their views, speak their minds to the extent that they feel they need to say a point. So we'll be giving space to do that. In the spirit of that, let's jump into it. Academic freedom, DEI, the future of the university, small topics that I'm sure we will completely resolve over the course of the next hour and a half. I want to start with DEI. My impression is that DEI as a term is becoming similar to the term woke. It means everything, and so it may mean nothing. It does mean something different in a lot of people's mouths, and each of you have spoken and written about it in a variety of different fashions. So what I want to start off with is give each of you, and we'll just go right down the row here to start, an opportunity to share with each other and with the audience how you understand DEI and how your professional experience has informed your thinking about it. Amna, please take it away.
Thanks, Chris. I think that's a really good question. One of the issues is that we never really talk about defining DEI, and everyone bandies around the term. So let me begin by saying that I think, both my experience as a student and a professor, the power of diversity for learning is irreplaceable. It is incredible, and it is a value that I strongly believe in. As someone who is the product of various educational systems in Pakistan, at Oxford, and then South Africa, and now the US, it's defined how I approach my work in terms of enriching the work that I do. So having said that, I do want to say that I think it'll be really helpful if we talk about DEI as a kind of differentiate between DEI and what my colleague Jeff and I have written about and called DEI Inc. And what I mean by DEI Inc. is, it's a logic, it has a lingo, and it has a practice. And the logic is that diversity is a customer service issue, education is the product, and students are customers, and that this needs to be managed top-down. And the lingo is that, lived experience, intent impact gap, trigger warnings, bias. I think we know what I'm talking about. And then, there is the practice, the administrative practices I'm talking about, which are usually trainings, anti-racism trainings, bias response teams, those kinds of initiatives that are becoming quite common on many campuses, especially elite campuses like Harvard. So I think it'd be useful to differentiate the values, DEI, from DEI Inc. And DEI Inc. is the thing that I have a problem with. We'll get into the problems later. But I do want to say that that entire model is built on it's underscored by a notion of harm, and that students somehow need to be protected from harm, as if we enter our classrooms dying to harm our students. So the battle lines to me are baffling when they're drawn in that fashion. But that is the way that DEI Inc. works, and it's very much about a safety and security model of teaching and learning, which to me is antithetical to what we do, because without taking risks, you don't learn.
Thanks so much. Stacy, please.
Thank you, Chris. I want to first thank Jonathan and Eric for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I'm very privileged to be here. Let me also apologize that I will be a bit note dependent, particularly on this first response, because I wanted to be pretty thoughtful in thinking about in advance what I wanted to say about this, because I think it's a bit of important table setting for this conversation. So let me tell you how I enter this conversation. I am actually a second career academic. Being an academic might actually be my third career, depending on how you count, but it's at the very least my second career. I spent about half of my career doing legal practice as an employment defense lawyer and a diversity practice management specialist. And I transitioned into the legal academy about 13 years ago with the intent to really be a part of not just the development of scholarship, but really the public discourse and the intellectual thought leadership around diversity as a matter of law, but also as a matter of policy and practice. And I've tried to do that in my work. As Eric introduced, I teach, I write, I speak, and I actually do still a limited amount of consulting around the intersection of law and diversity. And so I am a scholar, and I do believe in the scholarly methods with analytical and empirical rigor, but I am also an unabashed proponent of diversity. And whether you call it diversity, which I do as a shorthand for diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes also including belonging, I do think that it is a rather unassailable aspirational principle for us in this country. And the reason why I think that is because it is really consonant with some very foundational values that we have in our country and as a part of our democracy, and those are pluralism and equality. Those are really the underlying motivations for why we aspire to and we seek to achieve diversity. And so I think that when you understand diversity as being about in service to those ideals, I think we have a hard time disagreeing that it is a public good. That as Amna said, right, you can't really disagree with the concept. We can disagree with how we get there, how we operationalize this idea, but the idea itself, I think, is relatively unassailable. I think it's also a good question to ask what we mean by diversity, and part of my own kind of pet project is to always make an effort to define diversity in kind of contrast to affirmative action. And the two so often get conflated, both in law and in our public discourse, and I think it's so incredibly important to distinguish the two. And I think a lot of the misapprehension around diversity comes from that conflation. So, what is affirmative action? Affirmative action is this backward-looking project of redressing past discrimination, generally on behalf of people of color, African Americans in particular, and women, as a group based on our country's history of discrimination against those populations. So again, it is both backward-looking and remedial. Diversity, by contrast, is a forward-looking project. It is a forward-looking aspirational project that seeks, like I said, to pursue these fundamental values around pluralism and equality. And I think that distinction is incredibly important. I like to always point to Justice O'Connor's reasoning in the 2003 case in which the Supreme Court first recognized the interest in student body diversity in higher education. And I'm going to quote here a little bit at length because I think it embodies what diversity is and how it is connected to pluralism and equality. She said, "In order to cultivate a set of leaders with legitimacy in the eyes of the citizenry, it is necessary that the path to leadership be visibly open to talented and qualified individuals of every race and ethnicity." She goes on to say, "All members of our heterogeneous society must have confidence in the openness and integrity of the educational institutions that provide this training," end quote. Again, this statement, I think, embodies the ideal of diversity, which is, right, the pursuit of equality in service to pluralism, participation by all in our society. The other distinction that I want to make is between diversity and what I like to think of as this caricature of diversity that is created often by the opposition. That, not just conflates diversity with affirmative action, but then conflates diversity with this thing called critical race theory, or CRT, which is the new boogeyman. And, even to Amna's point, Diversity Inc., right, this kind of set of practices. And I think that diversity itself is a goal, and it is none of those other things. And it's important to remember that we can, again, debate about how we get to it, but the goal itself is, in my mind, to my kind of thinking, unassailable.
Thanks so much, Stacey. Ilya, please.
Well, I found myself agreeing at a 30,000-foot level with most of what Stacey just said, but the devil's in the details. And the problem is not the dictionary definition of those DEI words, right? Diversity, bringing together people with different backgrounds and perspectives so that it prevents groupthink, it enhances educational exchange, different ideas. Who could object to that? Equity, fairness, treating people fairly, or in the legal tradition, the Anglo-American legal tradition, centuries of courts of equity. Again, unobjectionable. Inclusion, people feeling welcome at their place of education or employment. Again, everyone wants that. The problem is the way that they've been applied, either by the Inc., kind of the corporate DEI trainers and bureaucracies, whether at corporate HR departments or in academic institutions, turns those very benign or even salutary terms on their head, and in effect subverts or prevents intellectual diversity, opposes equality, because you have to restructure things in terms of privilege hierarchies and raise certain voices and lower others and things like this, and excludes those who deviate from a radical orthodoxy. And part of that is, and again, my focus is on the not what goes on inside the classroom, the the discrimination based on ideology or viewpoint or otherwise in teaching and hiring. That is an issue with higher ed, and we might get into it, we might not. But to my mind, that's a different problem than the operationalization of this DEI ideology in a way that goes against those ideals, those dictionary definitions that I just gave. And you asked for my, kind of how my own work or life. I have a lived experience with the DEI bureaucracy, as it were, at Georgetown. And what I found was that, again, in practice, regardless of what we might think about the words or the goals, as Stacy has spelled them out, in practice, these DEI bureaucracies in higher ed go against the traditional classical liberal values of due process, free speech, treating everyone equally, academic freedom, and that's a real problem. So if we could just get back to having the old debates or discussions about, is there a problem that the hippies took over the faculty lounge at Berkeley and what have you, and are we properly applying federal and states anti-discrimination laws that I was familiar with when I was in college 25 years ago, or law school 20 years ago. But this more recent, postmodern, really, you could call it, because it. Okay, all right. Well, anyway, to the extent that some of the theory, well, at a theoretical level, some of the infusion could be characterized. But regardless, that's where the problem lies. It's not with people's aspiration to bring together, everyone to have different perspectives and make them feel welcome and have equal access to opportunities.
Thanks so much, Elia. Jeannie, please.
Thank you. So I will first note that I think that all of us are in agreement that diversity is an extremely important value and one that we believe to be extremely beneficial in an educational setting as well as in a workplace. So I think that's just getting that just off the bat, we all agree on that. DEI, what we don't agree on, apparently, is what DEI is. And so and I think it's important because that's why it's so hard to have these debates when you're not talking about the same thing. Everybody's talking about something different from each other. But to me, DEI is not just diversity, because if you ask most people whether they think diversity is a good thing, like people from different backgrounds and different experiences being together in one school and learning from each other, I don't think most people would say, no, I think that's a bad thing. What I want is lack of diversity and just kind of a monocultural situation. So I don't think we're debating about that. I think the debate is about DEI. And so first thing I'll say is when people have a problem with DEI, often what they have in mind is that sense that it's not just the idea of diversity. It's in fact, especially in a school setting, a set of ideas that have become very narrowed to one specific orthodoxy about what diversity means, what equity means, and what inclusion means, so that it shuts out a whole bunch of other ideas about what diversity, equity, and inclusion might be. So that's one thing, that it's a kind of narrowing of the ideas that are broadly appealing to many people, but then become a more narrow set of things. The other thing that people are thinking about is the creation of offices of diversity and inclusion. And of course, one cannot object in theory to the idea of an office to deal with a set of values and to promote a set of values that you prize and that you hope the university will promote. So it's not that in itself, but rather what has happened over the last, I would say, 10 years is that diversity offices, DEI offices, have done their work in a way that, whether in reality or in practice or in people's perception, has turned certain norms into rules and rule-like forms. So that, we're a very lawyer-heavy panel, and so I am not here to say I hate rules, But when you've got like a set of values, like, oh, we want everybody to be together and in a diverse learning environment, and then you kind of have the tendency, often with offices, administrative offices, this is something that happens, that they often don't feel like they really mean something or are doing something real unless they turn what they're doing into a set of rules that they can be enforced through discipline. Discipline of students and discipline of faculty with real consequences for violating those ideas. And I think that that's what, and then here's where it really gets into the tension with academic freedom. Because if the idea is you turn a certain idea of diversity into a rule-like phenomenon, and then people feel like they will be disciplined, essentially punished, for saying certain things that don't agree with those ideas, that's where you get the chill that so many of our students report in recent years about the classroom. And so I've been teaching at Harvard since 2006. That's when I joined the faculty. And of course, things change in that amount of time. You see lots of different societal changes being reflected in our students. But the one thing that I do know has changed is that the students do not feel as free to debate ideas or to express ideas that they're just trying on for size, that they may not have rehearsed it or they may not have really thought it through, but they're trying it out in real time so that people can react. That's harder to actually do as a teacher now, much harder. Because I used to teach, back in the day when there was more spontaneity that students were willing to allow themselves to engage in their thinking. And now it's much harder, and as a teacher, I have to have many different kinds of strategies to try to bring out that diversity. Ironically, we are as diverse as ever on campuses, but that diversity is more difficult to actually unearth in a conversation in a classroom. That's the thing that I find to be really corrosive about the way DEI has developed, that it has had a negative effect, even though the idea behind it is a really positive one. And so I essentially, think that people, when they mean DEI, they don't actually mean, the idea of diversity and everyone being together with all different kinds of ideas. What they mean is this exact phenomenon that I'm discussing, which is there's an office, they're looking over your shoulder, whether you're a teacher or a student, to see if you've violated certain ideas. And if you have, you might be disciplined. And that fear of being disciplined, because you know about one person or you know about that other person, or you've been called in for a talk to make sure that you're not, in fact, violating, and I think you used the word orthodoxy. I think that's a correct word. That you're not violating orthodoxy, and then you might, that has a terrible effect on intellectual inquiry and the ability to learn from each other. So it's like really opposed in effect to the whole purpose of having diversity on a campus.
I'm not wanting to jump in next, and then Stacy.
Thanks, Jeannie. I actually agree 100% with what you've said, and I just do want to say, which is why I call it DEI Inc., that far from being a caricature, I've seen that this is the dominant model on most institutions, particularly elite institutions. So I do recognize that when you talk about these things or when you kind of put them out there, they sound so ridiculous that they sound like a caricature, but they're not. This is based on looking at diversity initiatives or DEI initiatives at many institutions. And what I want to say is that I think diversity is absolutely, academic freedom and diversity can be really, they can go hand in hand. And in fact, the whole point is that we should be able to harness the power of diversity. And in order to harness that power, we have to have the space to question. What we find is that DEI Inc. is doing exactly that. It is getting in the way of harnessing the diversity of lived experience, the diversity of viewpoints, the diversity of the different ideas that students bring to campus. I can't access them anymore because there is a certain way of speaking on campus. There is a code, unwritten code, and that really, it's in my classroom too. Students are fundamentally unable to speak up, and it's not because they're scared of me. They will come privately and tell me that they're scared of their peers.
Stacy, please.
So 2 quick points. The first is that I think that there's a problem with critiquing and or opposing the operationalization and the professionalization of diversity if we say that that is a legitimate goal. Because one of the things that we know from diversity practice is that if there are not accountability structures, we have wanted diversity, we have wanted equality in this country, in our institutions for a very long time, and we have not managed to succeed in achieving it. And one of the problems is that there was not sufficient structure and accountability around that goal. And so without the structure and accountability that, you know, Jeannie and Amna are, and I guess Ilya as well, are complaining about, we would have no ability to make meaningful progress. That's number one. So for instance, we realized in this country that we had an ethics problem with respect to business practices, and so we developed compliance offices, right? Because we realized that in order for us to actually achieve our goals of ethical practice, we needed to have a professionalized structure, right? To hold those standards, right, up and to make sure people were accountable to those. That's all we're doing around diversity. And I don't think that, again, the problem should be the idea in its conception of having structures and operationalizing this ideal. Maybe it's how it's done. The second thing that I will say is, again, I think that diversity is being laid to blame for Diversity Inc., you know, the idea for the mere fact that what we know is that when you introduce diversity into a context, it's going to create friction. It's going to create problems. You can look at Robert Putnam. You can look at Roosevelt Thomas, right? You can look at David Ely. You can look at all of these people who have researched diversity, and they have told you, right? What has happened over the last 10 to 20 years in higher education is not diversity. It's the increasing diversity of our institutions, especially our student bodies. So we now have student bodies that are 45% non-white. We only have faculties that are 24% non-white, right? That's going to create some tension, right? We talk about the fact that it is the imposition of these diversity expectations, but perhaps it's simply just the introduction of diversity into our institutions. That's going to create discomfort. That's going to make it harder to have the same conversations, to do the same things, to say and behave in the same ways that we used to. But that doesn't mean that it's not a worthwhile exercise to try.
So Amna wanted to jump in next, and then Jeannie, and then Ilya, I'd like to bring you in on this as well. Please, Amna.
Now, far be it from me to say that colleges and universities have done things perfectly. In fact, I think my role at my own institution is to constantly critique it because I want it to be better. So yes, I don't think that they've been particularly great about diversity. But as you noted, 45% of the student body is now not white. That means we are seeing more diversity. It is happening. It's not like it's being stymied. And I would argue that there is no place like higher education that has made a commitment to diversity and is making efforts. They're not perfect, but is doing it. Now, the problem to my mind is, and I've lost my train of thought, so it's going to come back.
Can I bring Jeannie in on this?
Yeah, bring
Jeannie,
Jeannie
please.
in.
Yeah.
So at Harvard, more than 50% of the student body is not white. And we will see in a month, within a month, I think, whether that holds true for the class that's admitted this year, given the Supreme Court ruling saying that colleges and universities can no longer use race-based affirmative action. So this is, and this is something that many people are concerned about, like how do we actually accomplish the diversity on college campuses without the use of affirmative action, and we'll have to work that out over the next few years. But what I want to say is that the increasing diversity, I think Stacey is right, that studies show that there's going to be friction. It is easier to get along with a group that's really just, not diverse. People just have an easier time. But that's, of course, not the experience we want to create for our students, an easy time. We want to have, in fact, some friction, especially in the classroom, so that we can learn from that friction. and learn from those disagreements that would emerge out of the diversity. But, you know, it's not really about trying to diagnose why there might be more tension and friction on a college campus in a diverse situation. It's really trying to zero in on the way that DEI offices and DEI programs have been counterproductive to the harnessing of the diversity and friction. So I don't think it's enough to say, well, there are plenty of other reasons for friction. Yes, there are many reasons for friction. But in terms of the DEI offices and the work that they are doing, it's what we're observing is that when people feel that this is going beyond really just the concepts that Ilya mentioned, like of discrimination that we know from federal law. All universities that receive federal funding, including Harvard, are bound by federal law. That means that we have to make sure that we are addressing actual discrimination and trying to prevent discrimination, whether it's sex discrimination or race discrimination or discrimination on the base of religion or other kinds of protected categories. And so that is all having to go on, regardless of the creation of DEI offices and administrators, which is a separate phenomenon that, of course, they have the goal that they have in common with the federal law and the implementation of federal law is to create a non-discriminatory environment in which a diverse campus can flourish with everyone feeling like they are included. But at the same time, DEI officers are not actually charged only with the enforcement of federal law, because that would have to go on anyway. What DEI offices are doing are something beyond that. And I just want to make one suggestion, which is one way that I think Harvard Law School has been really great, you know, just to praise my own dean, John Manning, who is now the acting provost, is that he understood early on that we were going to create a diversity and equity and inclusion program and hire a DEI officer who was also, her job was also going to be administering the promotion of academic freedom on our campus. And in that way, we were able to conceptualize diversity in this broader way, that it is about the diversity of all kinds of viewpoints in addition to backgrounds. And so the diversity officer is working all the time with, say, like the minorities, political minorities on our campus, conservatives, right, who are the main political minorities. And so the DEI officer is looking out for their academic freedom as well as the academic freedom of other people on campus, including racial minorities and sexual minorities, et cetera. So I think that concept can actually be workable if you have the right way to think about diversity at a higher level of generality and have bureaucrats and administrators who get it, that this is not about quelching certain viewpoints because somehow they are not promoting academic freedom or not promoting DEI, but rather to include within DEI the protection of the academic freedom of diverse points of view.
Ilya, I want to bring you into this because I haven't heard from you, so
Yeah.
I see you want to speak to this, yeah.
Well, Ginny said a lot of what I would have wanted to say, and this latest development is interesting. I wonder whether those roles are sort of collapsing into what 20, 25 years ago we would have just thought of as something that student affairs does, making sure that people are not falling through the cracks and they have resources available for them, whether it's academic or extracurricular or whatever the case might be, ombudsman's offices and things like this. Because there is definitely more friction and tension and chill of speech and conversation. And all those measures have seemed to have, negative measures have seemed to have increased as DEI offices have increased. And it seems like DEI and the belonging bit have failed on their own terms, based on student surveys, climate surveys, that says that students are less comfortable, feel less welcome, whether it's racial minorities or anyone else, feel less comfortable with difference and diversity and different ideas and things like this. So something is clearly going wrong there, and I think it is the programming that teaches students to view things through their identitarian lenses, sharpening those differences and accelerating a self-segregation in a certain sense, and an awareness that everyone is different. You have to walk on eggshells because otherwise you might commit a microaggression or one of these other violations that really goes against the inherent mission of any academic institution. So yeah, I agree that the student affairs office or the admissions office needs to look out for to make sure that to counteract these forces. And also, I agree it's not related so much to race-based affirmative action. There's some overlap, but this chill, this tension, this friction is not because of mismatch necessarily or other problems with racial discrimination, race-based affirmative action, same thing, but because of these trainings and programs and structures put in on the non-teaching side of the ledger in higher ed.
I wanted to jump in here, and then Stacy, but maybe throw out another idea. I do want us at some point to start turning this conversation and put it into conversation with academic freedom as well. But maybe provocatively, let me just say the following. Traditional liberal values, tolerance, open-mindedness, and so forth, I guess we don't have much problem with those being enforced. It seems like the ire is raised when other values are enforced. So at least I sometimes hear a bit of a tension, or perhaps more provocatively, a bit of a hypocrisy, which is, well, enforce these values but not these. And I'm wondering if you think that that's fair. Probably the answer from some of you is absolutely not. But perhaps a follow-up, and then Stacy, I'll give you the floor, is a true, maybe, liberal position on this in a country that has so many universities and which there's wide mobility opportunities for many people, is let 100 flowers bloom. You want to have a university that leans heavily into DEI enforcement, let it advertise itself as such, and students will go there who are comfortable. You want a university that leans heavily into open-mindedness and free speech and so forth, so be it. You shop around, you know what you're getting into, exit and entrance is no problem. Is that not, I grew up in rural Northeast Ohio. The Amish aren't very particularly liberal, but they live in a liberal society that allows them to live as Amish. Why are we getting bent out of shape if some universities lean in one direction and others lean in another? It seems illiberal to want a one-size-fit-all. But Stacy, please, and then Amna. Yeah.
So the first thing that I want to say is back to this argument about diversity really fomenting divisiveness. I think that, number one, correlation is not causation, and you might be able to correlate the rise of diversity offices with the increase kind of self-awareness and tension among various identity groups on campuses, but that does not mean that one caused the other. In fact, one could say that the very reason why these diversity offices were created was because of the increasing diversity within these communities that required some measure of management, some measure of attention that was not suited to student affairs, which already has an enormous job, and to add to the burden of their responsibilities would have been unfair. And so as we began to become more inclusive, right, more expansive, more equitable in our access to higher education, there was a need to manage that diversity more effectively. And again, we know that the research says diversity is going to create, at least in the beginning, conflict. It's going to create tension. That is a necessary consequence. And so I think it's unfair to lay blame on diversity for the consequence of just our demographic change in higher education. In terms of liberal values, so I do not think that diversity is at all in tension with values of open-mindedness and inclusion and those sorts of things. What diversity can often come into conflict with are these kind of libertarian, individualistic values such as academic freedom and individual liberty interest. And I don't think that that's a new tension. It is actually an age-old tension both in our law and in our social policy. So if you think back to the civil rights movement, you had on the one hand African Americans demanding that the guarantee of equality under law be made real in terms of their equal participation and equal access. And so again, an enforcement of an equality value, and you had the opposition saying, but our individual liberty interest, right? Our individual associational interest demands that we be able to associate with whomever we want, and if that means we want to discriminate, we ought to be able to discriminate, right? Those values have always come into conflict. That kind of individualism against this kind of broader value of pluralism, and I think that over time we have, quite frankly, as a matter of law and policy, vacillated between privileging individualism and privileging equality and pluralism. And I'd like to think that history has judged harshly those moments when we have privileged individualism over pluralism and equality. And so I'd like to think that we've learned from that history, and we realize that we cannot allow those claims of individualism, even in the interest of academic freedom, a prized value I do not deny on behalf of higher education, to override to the point of destroying our commitment to equality and pluralism.
Amna and then Jeannie.
So I'm desperate to jump in right now, right? A couple of things. My train of thought finally came back to station, and diversity creates friction, and that is a good thing. That is the power of diversity. The problem, and you've articulated it so well, is exactly, I want conflict. I don't want people punching each other, but I do want disagreement, because without that, there is no kind of enriching of our understanding of the world. So, but the bureaucratic response is exactly what you said: manage the conflict, which is fundamentally antithetical to what I want to do in my classroom when I'm teaching. I want to get into the conflict. I want them to lean into it, not in a way that they're awful to each other, but in a way that the ideas are competing with each other, that we're hashing them out. So I think the bureaucracy, the DEI bureaucracy, is definitely in the management mode. They want to manage everything, and that is what creates a chilling effect, because that then means that there is a right way to behave on campus. But I want to turn to academic freedom, and I want to say this. I don't think academic freedom is a libertarian value. Free speech, maybe you could say, but academic freedom is quintessential to what we do. It is the freedom to teach with the expertise that you have. Now, often people confuse academic freedom with free speech. You can go out on the quad and say whatever you want to say. It doesn't have to be verified, and it can be false. That's free speech. In a classroom, you cannot do that. And you have to be, there are norms, there's professional norms that we have, and you can't just go and say the earth is flat. So you have to teach, it's rooted in your expertise. That is where the freedom comes from. And if you read very carefully the 1915 AAUP Academic Freedom Articulation, it's worth pointing out that academic freedom isn't your right to mouth off in class about whatever you want. There are serious responsibilities. Academic freedom comes, the very definition of it includes those responsibilities. So I don't like this way in which academic freedom is seen as the kind of right of a professor to say whatever. The fact that some professors have done that, yes, of course, there are always people who do a bad job at something. The professoriate is large in the US. But I'd say the vast majority of people who teach with integrity, and academic freedom works to the benefit of learning. It is the single sole reason that US universities are the envy of the world. And it is fundamentally dedicated to education.
I want to bring Jeannie in on this. I promised her the floor next, but then Stacey, I'll circle back with you, and then Ilya, please. Yep.
Some people want to defend academic freedom, but they won't defend free speech, and I will defend both. And one thing I will say is that I don't think this is about the right to discriminate. that we're all arguing that like people should discriminate and have the right to do that, and so that's part of the libertarian, situation that we're trying to promote. No, I really think that really misunderstands the situation. Of course, we all understand that sometimes discrimination happens with the things people say and stuff that comes out of your mouth, right? That is one way that discrimination can occur. But if it is discrimination, then it would be enforced through the school's rules against discrimination, which do exist. And the bottom line is the DEI project that I'm talking about is really, really distinct from that particular project. And when you start turning the norms of DEI, which are apart from the anti-discrimination rules that we are all bound by, and you start turning those into rule-like forms, you get a really different thing. I think the idea of enforcement, we have to be clear on what we mean by that. I mean, in the criminal law, enforcement is through criminal prosecution, but there are lots of other kinds of enforcement that are through rules and law, and then there are forms of enforcement that are not through rules, but through kind of culture, and they're all really, they're distinct from each other, and some enforcement is through dialogue and through debate, where you're not enforcing as in saying this is the right way to think about it, but rather you're presenting ideas in a pedagogical situation where people can respond and disagree. The one thing I will say about the lessons of history is that we know that the civil rights movement was responsible for some of the biggest wins for free speech, for constitutional First Amendment-based free speech in the United States, including the famous Supreme Court case of New York Times versus Sullivan. And so it used to be that the civil rights movement very much thought of free speech and the right to say things that are, dissonant and that made people uncomfortable, and that challenged people and critiqued them, that those used to be so central to our memory of the civil rights movement. But it's really interesting that these days, when you think about civil rights, that a very experienced practitioner of law and a constitutional law professor could think that, actually these things, it's not, free speech is not really the thing that the civil rights movement is about. Well, I actually would emphasize how much free speech was central to the fight for civil rights for racial minorities and other minorities in the United States. And they just really go hand in hand. And I think that that's playing out on our campuses, that the more we have an orthodoxy that makes people unwilling to say their views, everyone is actually being prevented from doing things like critique and critiquing the status quo and critiquing the dominant majority, and I really think that's a shame.
Stacey, I know that you wanted to respond, and then Ilya, I wanted to bring you in on this as well, please.
I just wanted to respond to Amina, and I think to some extent also to Jeannie. I find it interesting that there is a willingness to concede that in the domain of academic freedom, sometimes people might get it wrong, sometimes people might misapprehend, misapply, even corrupt the idea and the practice of academic freedom, but that still preserves fundamentally the idea and the ideal, right? We do not discard, right, academic freedom simply because some people sometimes get it wrong. And yet, what I think I'm hearing, and I think certainly in the broader public discourse, what's often charged is that because sometimes people do diversity wrong, we should just abandon the effort entirely. And I think that that's unfair. I think that surely, yes, are mistakes made? Do people sometimes get it wrong? Undoubtedly. But does that mean we should abandon the enterprise entirely? Absolutely not. I think that, it's really important to understand what we mean when we say people are getting it wrong. So for instance, when I talk about the caricature of DEI, if you look, for instance, at some of the past or proposed legislation banning quote unquote DEI,
I put my hand in a lot of that.
College and university campuses, I think that some of the things that they talk about in terms of teaching people that they're inherently, guilty or responsible, that's just a caricature, right? Like, that's just a misapprehension. If someone somewhere is doing that, they are wrong, but in the vast majority of places, that's not really happening. So what is it are we attacking? What are we talking about? What are we maligning? I think, to your point about defining diversity, let's define the practices that we think are noxious, right? The practices that we are debating in terms of problematic, so that we can get to the real issue. Because if we all agree that we should all be pursuing the goal of diversity, it's just a question of how, then let's talk about what you think is going wrong so that we can agree on how we do it right. The other thing that I will say about the AUP statement on academic freedom, and Amna said, right, 1915, it goes back to 1915. Who was in the room in 1915 constructing that statement? And that statement still informs how we think about academic freedom, what it means, and what kinds of rights and responsibilities it entails, right? A statement that was crafted by all white men, all, by the way, from elite institutions, right, on behalf of themselves and their other all-white male faculty colleagues, and even to the extent that nominally it was about their students, those too were almost always all white male. That is simply not the reality that we live in today. And we have not updated those principles. We have not really updated the idea of what academic freedom means, and in particular, what the responsibility around academic freedom entails in light of those evolving circumstances in terms of the demographic diversity that we have on our college campuses, and even evolving social norms around the value for diversity and equity and inclusion.
So Ilya, I'm going to give you the floor. I also just want to mention that in a few minutes, we're going to start turning this over to audience questions. Ilya, I know that you'd want to speak. I know you want a quick follow-up, but then I'm going to turn to audience questions. So if you have not yet started, please do submit them with the QR code so that I can take a look at them, and we can then bring you into this conversation. Ilya, please. Yeah.
Well, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were written by all white men, some of whom even owned slaves. It doesn't, that fact doesn't delegitimize those documents.
We've had to update the Constitution.
Sure, but I mean,
because of that fact.
Okay.
It excluded a lot of people.
No, it wasn't. Anyway, the point is, DEI as practiced in offices in higher ed is almost always wrong. It's not sometimes wrong. It's not occasionally wrong. It's almost always wrong in the sense that it subverts classical liberal principles of the academic mission of open inquiry and truth-seeking and knowledge creation and research and debating ideas and what have you. Amna began her very first remarks at the top of this program by talking about the warping of the concept of harm. And that's a big part of the problem with DEI offices. The idea, Hannah Holborn Gray, the former president of the University of Chicago, who's still alive, one of the first women presidents of a major academic institution in the country, said that education is not supposed to make you feel comfortable. It's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. That's how you know that you're learning and that you're grappling with ideas and you're growing and you're thinking and developing. DEI offices are against that, and they're against they use terms like harassment and discrimination and terms from psychology, other beyond harm, to enforce rigid orthodoxies and to say that when you say something, when you convey an idea that someone doesn't like or feels offended by, you're creating harm, and that needs to be investigated, if not disciplined. And oftentimes, of course, the investigation, the process, is the punishment with these kangaroo courts and all the other problems in a host of ways. And so the problem is the DEI offices are not based in academic values. Again, this is not about radical professors indoctrinating or what have you. This is precisely non-professors, and indeed at most institutions now, there are more non-teaching staff than faculty, which I think is a problem. And in the last decade, most of the growth in the non-teaching staff has been in the DEI space, which fundamentally subverts, regardless of what your ideology is, or nothing to do with that, but it subverts the all of the mission of the academy, which I don't think, regardless of what your identity is, if you want to engage in higher education, I think that's a valid mission. If you want to blow it all up and restructure it because it's all illegitimate, that's a perspective. I disagree with that, but if you want to actually have higher ed in the classical conception, then DEI is incompatible with it, as practiced.
I'm not, you want to jump in. I'm also going to be looking at the questions as you do, so I didn't want you to think I'm ignoring.
I wouldn't think that ever. So a couple of things that I want to address. Ilya said some of the things that I wanted to say, but I'll come back to this question of academic freedom being defined in 1915 and never having been revisited. Untrue. 1940 it was revisited. It was revisited in the 1970s. Amendments were made. AAUP has been, if you read their reports, there are extra reports on what academic responsibility is, and those are detailed. These things are being discussed. And also, I must protest this reductionist idea that just because those men were white, these values are therefore white, is precisely the kind of thinking I do not want my students to be doing. We are making assumptions that just because of the color of your skin or your identity, I want my students to rise beyond what they look like. I want them to transcend that. And I think the people who wrote the 1915 Declaration transcended themselves. They wrote specifically about minority students and creating space for those students to be able to speak up. That's the idea of academic freedom that I'm defending. But I also want to come to the question of harm that Ilya said, and I agree, what bothers me is this way in which harm underpins everything in DEI Inc., but it also underpins, Ilya, some of the legislation that we see coming from the right. In Florida, it's framed in terms of harm and discomfort, and I wish that they too would read Hannah Holborn's statement and think about that. And finally, I want to say about the issue of banning DEI offices by legislation. While I am very critical of DEI offices, there is no space and should be no space for interference from the legislature on academic matters. And the argument that this is, but it's public money, therefore we owe it to the public, the people who do the tarmac, the road tarmac, I pay taxes, they do it. They decide what the materials they're going to use. I don't have a say in what materials, because they're the experts. I don't get to decide how municipal things will be done in detail at that level. So while I say there are many problems in the academy, and I think there are, I'm not denying them, I do not believe that state interference is the way to go. And I'll tell you, I come from a society where we've ruined our public education precisely because of that. It's a very slippery slope and a very dangerous one.
Just real quick, I don't think, I agree with you that state legislature shouldn't be telling you what to teach inside the classroom or what classes to teach, but how the university, a public university, organizes itself and the bureaucracy therein, that's a valid thing. Just like it's a valid thing to say, okay, at this university we're going to focus on liberal arts, on this university we're focused on STEM. Those kind of big pictures, regulatory, bureaucratic decisions, I think, are fair game for state legislatures. But that, again, is different than regulating speech in the classroom or what you write on and things like that.
Yeah, and I think, if legislatures were saying that only X% of the public funds should be used for university bureaucracy, that would be a very different matter. But this is ideologically charged, the attack on DEI. So I don't want to say that this is, somehow that is okay. It is very ideologically charged because they're not going after other bureaucracies on campus, which are equally as expansive, and we've seen the bloat on college campuses of administration.
We have now some great questions, and they get voted up. So this is the most popular one, and it'll be a collective challenge for us. So the question itself is, can we hear about some specific examples of things that DEI offices on campus do where you all might disagree on whether or not those are good things to do? So I see the question here as us finding something that a DEI office has done where some of you will say, I think this was a good thing that the DEI office did. I'm guessing, Ilya, you won't have many examples of those, right, from what I'm hearing. Maybe Stacy will. So, Stacy, I might want to start with you on this, unless you want me to go elsewhere.
No, I'm the one that raised the question of what are the actions, the efforts, the practices that are being maligned as problematic. I would like to know what those are.
So
other than making people feel bad, which to Amna's point, I mean, I think that, there is a contradiction bordering on hypocrisy for the opposition to say, right, that these practices are harmful to some people's interest if these practices are designed, right, to forestall harm on behalf of other people's interests. And so, I don't understand what the problem is. And so if we could get some concrete examples of where diversity goes wrong, I'd be happy to respond.
I do want to bring Jeannie back into this. So, Jeannie, do you have an example that you want to propose that we work with?
Yes. So I am an attorney representing students and faculty in universities, including my own, in disciplinary matters. So that has included all kinds of disciplinary matters, including under things like Title IX policies or anti-discrimination policies, or just DEI type of proceedings, an ad board, all of those things. So I have a wealth of knowledge about the kinds of things that people are accused of, specifically in the disciplinary context. I will start with one of my own. I will start with my own situation, which is that I often, and I think I'm known among students at HLS for bringing multiple perspectives into the debate, and sometimes knowing that 100% of the class, or might be like unwilling to go somewhere, I assign students positions. For example, if it's like, oh, what did Justice Scalia say, and what did Justice Kennedy say? Okay, now you're going to be Justice Scalia, and you're going to be Justice Kennedy, and you're basically going to have the debate that they had behind closed doors in, say, a case that we are studying, right? Well, it once happened, not just once, but a few times, that in one particular case that, and this is, the case of a constitutional case about whether there should be a constitutional protection for same-sex sexual conduct, right? A constitutional protection so that it could not be criminalized. And this is a case that, of course, lawyers who are going to do constitutional law are going to have to grapple with going forward, because it might get overruled, right? And so we need to argue and learn the arguments that are going to either lead to the overruling or to fight against the overruling, right? That's what you're training your students for. So when I do that, assign students the different sides and really, say what we want is the real meat of the argument on both sides. Well, it has happened that students who were, in the class, not necessarily the ones who were assigned, it was never the students who were assigned, went to the DEI office and said, I was really harmed by having to listen to Justice Scalia's argument. I was harmed, and so I would like to file a complaint. Now, at Harvard Law School, we have our own DEI office and our own Title IX office and our own, Dean of Students and all that. So what they're doing with cases like that is dismissing them off the bat because of academic freedom, and saying this does not actually violate the rules of our school, it does not violate anti-discrimination policies, it does not violate any rules by which people are bound. And that is the end of the matter. And I would not even find out about it. I would just be happily just going along my way. And the only reason I know about it is because later on, I happen to have heard that this happened from people who know, namely the DEI officer who was there at the time. But I know that elsewhere within Harvard, because of my work as a lawyer, that would lead to, or could, and plausibly would, lead to an investigation, which could take a year and a half, during which that professor, or it could have even been a student who made who said, well, I agree with Justice Scalia in this way or whatever, that could take, and even if at the end of the day the decision is you are not actually guilty of violating any policy, what would have happened is, because of the norms of DEI and the idea that the person who has complained must be given some form of vindication to remedy their harm, the investigation itself would have had the effect, maybe not desired, but of harming academic freedom, of harming the ability to learn, the skills that people are supposed to learn, and of essentially disrupting the life of the person who has been investigated. And do you think that they're going to then go back to teaching the way that they did before by trying to get the voices of different perspectives in that way? I wouldn't take that risk if I knew that I was at a school that where my life could be upended that way. I would not. But I teach at Harvard Law School, where I know that I will be protected from that kind of inadvisable investigation.
So I was an employment lawyer in practice for many years, and I did a lot of training, sexual harassment training in particular, which is required under some state laws and is certainly advisable under Supreme Court precedent for those employers who don't want to be liable when sexual harassment occurs in their workplace. And it turns out that after you do sexual harassment training, sexual harassment complaints go up. But I've never heard anyone say we should certainly not do sexual harassment training. We should not advise people of what sexual harassment is and notify them that it is illegal in the workplace and that there is a mechanism for them to lodge a complaint should they feel that they have been the victim of sexual harassment. And yet, we create diversity offices, right? Maybe we do diversity training at the very least, right? We kind of inform students of our values around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and perhaps provide them with these mechanisms for lodging complaints if they think we're not living up to those values. And all of a sudden, the problem is diversity, right? Not the fact that, and by the way, these complaints of sexual harassment are not that the training is creating the harassment. The training is simply surfacing behavior that always existed. We've now given them a language and a mechanism, right, for disclosing that conduct. And most organizations think that it's actually a positive outcome for them to be made aware of these things so that they can resolve them. Because the reality is, if that sexual harassment was occurring, it was being disruptive to the workplace, whether the employer knew it or not, whether or not they were taking steps to forestall that or to correct that, it was creating some sort of problems in the workplace, and the employer just didn't know it. The same is true for diversity. We have had evidence for years now that students who are underrepresented in institutions of higher education have not been having positive experiences, right? They simply have not. And now that we've given them a mechanism, a language, and an opportunity to share with us the ways in which they've not been having a positive experience, we're somehow blaming, right, diversity rather than whatever structures, policies, or practices that existed, right, that are simply being surfaced by a diversity. And like I said, we would never say that, harassment training is a bad thing, right? The fact that it generates, increased harassment complaints means that we should just stop doing it. It's the problem, right? Not the fact that harassment is actually the problem, and this is giving us an opportunity to correct harassment. We look at diversity and we say, oh, it's bringing all of these issues to our attention. Ilya said something earlier, that it's identitarian, and it's all of a sudden making people focus on their identities. I don't think that diversity has made people aware of their gender, their race, right? Their sexual orientation. People were aware of those things. I, for instance, teach critical race theory, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I will say, when I teach that class, which is not the same thing as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's not taught in K through 12 schools, by the way, students often tell me, especially students of color, it simply gives them a language, a way of understanding and expressing an experience that they've always had. It's not creating any experience. It's not creating anything new for these students. It is simply giving them a way to express, to sometimes surface, and to make known, right? So that people who are interested in responding to those experiences can do so. And I think that that was the point. As our universities became more diverse, there was a need, right, to be responsive to that increased diversity. We knew, based on the data, these students were not having a positive experience. It turns out that for many of them, due to that negative experience, they were having underachievement, they were not persisting, they were not matriculating to graduation and degree attainment, and all of these things matter, right? And diversity gives us a way to do all of that better. And I think that we're pointing to the wrong problem in saying that diversity is actually our problem, rather than saying that we had these problems. Diversity is surfacing for us, right? Diversity is uncovering some of the simmering tensions that long existed, and it's giving us a mechanism for trying to begin to resolve them.
I know you wanted to jump in, and then I'm going to turn to try to get one or two more questions in, please.
I think it's very useful to ground our conversation in actual incidents, because we are talking quite abstractly. And like, diversity as a value is not the issue, we all agree, but it's about how things are implemented. So let me bring up a few. American University recently abolished all indoor protests. And I want to read to you, I have here the language that they used. And I want you to notice how the language of inclusion is actually being used to quell speech. Recent events and incidents on campus have made Jewish students feel unsafe and unwelcome. This was the rationale for stopping indoor protests. At Barnard College, their dorms, students can no longer put any posters outward facing on their doors, in their dorm doors, because they don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. These are ways of actively limiting the free speech of our students. But let me bring it to academic freedom. At Hamline University, I don't know how many of you followed this, Stacy has, of course. At Hamline University in Minnesota, there was an adjunct art history professor. Note that the policies actually affect precisely the kinds of person negatively that they're supposedly protecting. So adjunct faculty member who's teaching a course on global art history. And in the spirit of decolonizing the syllabus and bringing non-Western contexts to the students, shows students and had warned them in the syllabus and in class. This was a hybrid class, and she told them that anyone who did not want to see this imagery could turn it off before she put the slide up. And the slide was 2 paintings of Prophet Muhammad. Both reverential paintings done by a Muslim for a Muslim patron precisely to honor the Prophet, 14th and 16th century. A Muslim student, despite the warning, chose to see that painting and then said she was harmed and went to the DEI office. And what did the DEI Inclusive Excellence Officer do? Single-handedly, without even consulting the professor and any conversation with the professor, said, and the president, the two of them decided that she was going to be let go of. She's no longer going to be teaching at Hamline, and said that what she did was Islamophobic. In taking that student's position as representing the position of 2 million plus Muslims, the diversity office squelched the diversity within the Muslim tradition and fired an adjunct faculty member. Or fired isn't the right word, didn't continue the contract. So this is a very concrete example. And not only that, both the DEI person and the president, much to my amazement, said that when the feelings of our students are being harmed, that needs to take precedence over academic freedom. So what am I to do? Just extend this. A Christian evangelical student saying, I am harmed by studying evolution. Or saying, I refuse to see a picture of 2 men kissing in an art history course where you're looking at photographs of Mapplethorpe. That is the road we go down. So these are instances that are concrete, and I'm happy to discuss them further.
Ilya, I wanted to bring another question to you, and I feel that this is parallel enough that we can continue with the examples. This one was the second most popular question. For those of you here on the panel who are critical of the current accountability structures, DEI offices, what would be put in its place to make the achievement of diversity goals possible? In other words, if the current state of affairs is to be undone, what, if anything, should be put in its place? And Ilya, let's start with you, since I know you've thought a lot about this.
I'll throw in one more example. Right around a year ago, the DEI dean's facilitation of the shutdown of a federal judge at Berkeley, at Stanford Law School, fomenting the mob and not enforcing university policy. In fact, inflaming what was going on, not for anything that he was saying, but because of who he represents and that he makes people uncomfortable and feel harmed and all the rest of it. Okay, so what should replace the DEI offices? Nothing. You know, again, student affairs, if you need help with whatever it is, you know, whether it's remedial, you know, tutoring, whether it's funding for your cultural organization, whether it's whatever concern you might have, or an ombudsman, or yeah, if someone's harassing you, you report that. I mean, this does not affect the Title IX compliance officers, does not affect the Title VI compliance officers, lawyers who enforce anti-discrimination law, and all the rest of it. This is the non-legally mandated stuff, and you know, if the question goes towards, you know, because we're talking about different kinds of diversity, Stacy mostly talks about, you know, subsumes, I think, all of DEI with just capital D diversity, which I understand, and that's a fair way of talking about it. But if we're just talking about diversity, if we're talking about, well, the Supreme Court struck down race-based admissions, what do we do now? How do we still promote diversity? And the answer is you make sure that you're recruiting from places and you know, that you might not otherwise, that students that are capable of doing the work and are suitable for your institution are aware of the opportunities and financial aid and all the rest of it. You know, it's more work for admissions officers to do that. Kind of the classic affirmative action without getting into issues of preference. But if it goes beyond, you know, again, I don't know what in the question diversity means, but if it goes beyond making sure that we're not you know, just replicating the current makeup of the student body forever. If it's, you know, making sure that we're looking everywhere, well, yeah, you pursue strategies to do that. But actually on campus, once they're there, yeah, we don't need separate, you know, bureaucracies to subvert teaching norms, to enforce these cognitive behavioral theories, to impose identitarian lenses and privilege hierarchies and all the rest of it. That's just pure negative.
I do want to bring Jeannie in on this, and then Stacey, I know that you want to speak to it as well. Jeannie, please. Yeah.
Well, I will just say, realistically speaking, it's probably, unless there's going to be some heavy hand of the law, like those state legislative measures, we're probably not going to see the full-scale destruction of DEI offices and bureaucracies, and we're not going to be firing like hundreds of our, you know, like of employees. For example, at Harvard, we do have hundreds of employees in the DEI bureaucracy. We're not going to be doing that, and I don't think that that's realistic. Nor do I think it's desirable. What I think would be ideal are just a bunch of measures that you can do, like the one I mentioned at Harvard Law School, where you sort of have officials who are really understanding about the consonants, not the opposition, of academic freedom and diversity, equity, and inclusion, that you see them in the same framework and you understand that it's about the diversity of different backgrounds and different viewpoints and about promoting that, along with the frictions that come with it, and to understand when friction turns into the kind of conflict that we would actually call discrimination. Discrimination, not okay. Harassment, not okay. But the kinds of disagreements, that's exactly what we want, and discomfort, yes, we want that, and we want friction. So there are some bureaucratic moves you could make within the bureaucracy. I also think that I know that, for example, at Harvard, there has been recently, like PEN America came to Harvard, and they did trainings for a lot of our administrators. And a lot of those people were diversity officials. And PEN America is a free speech organization that is very much about promoting free speech and academic freedom, and they're doing it in a really reasonable way. And so I think that part of it is like, when you come into a job with a certain orientation and a certain kind of, understanding of what your job is about, it's possible to change that understanding. This is a learning opportunity and an educational institution after all. So I think that everyone can be open to that kind of education and of revising ideas of what should happen. I also think in terms of enforcement, we need to get away from this punitive model that enforcement can only happen if we punish people, because there's a whole lot that diversity officers can do that is not sort of in the vein of punishment or potential punishment. And if you get a call from a DEI officer, most people, their hearts sink because they think they're about to be, brought up on some kind of charges. And I think that could also be changed so that the DEI officer is really someone who is also part of the educational project as opposed to the punitive disciplinary project.
Stacy, please.
So I think that it's not going to be possible, if we all agree that diversity is a legitimate goal, to dismantle these diversity structures entirely, as Ilya suggested. And the reason is the literature and the research is very clear. So Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kalev have done some of the most important research, and quite frankly did a piece back in 2006 that is often misquoted. It was titled "Diversity Best Practices or Diversity Best Guesses," and a lot of people cited that for the proposition that diversity training doesn't work. Much more nuanced than that. But one of the things that people overlook in citing that study is that one definitive conclusion that they came to is that if you want to achieve diversity, what you have to have are accountability structures. Like, diversity doesn't work without accountability structures. It simply doesn't. So if you say diversity is our goal, we want to pursue and achieve diverse student bodies, we can't arrive at that goal without having some sort of accountability structures. It's necessary. What they look like, we can talk about. How they operate, and I agree with Jeannie. I think that oftentimes we do focus on the punitive. So to take the Hamlin, or even, I'll put Stanford aside, but to take the Hamlin situation, I think that, and I was actually just doing a session for a leadership development program at Rutgers around this, that we seem to have one tool, to Jeannie's point, in the toolbox around, responding to these conflicts between academic freedom and diversity, and that is punitive, right? To just kind of discipline the speaker. And I think that that's not always necessary, and it's not always the right answer. And so the other side of that equation is that perhaps if there are reasons why we cannot or should not address the speaker in many instances, although not in all instances, a faculty member, we can focus our efforts on accommodating and supporting the student, right? Because after all, it's not just about diversity and equity, it's also about inclusion, right? And belonging. And so how do we make that student feel supported, included, and that they belong in this community in spite of, right, what that professor is doing, which we don't want to, micromanage. And so there are going to sometimes be resolutions that are on the student side or the kind of receiving side. I will say to the Stanford Law School incident, and so we often say in terms of free speech, but I think it's probably equally true, although this involved free speech, not academic freedom, because it was an outside speaker, that the best response to noxious speech is not censorship, it is counter speech. And there is a way in which that associate dean engaged in counter speech. Institutions of higher education are entitled to their own free speech. They can actually speak, and to the extent that they express values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, commitments to ensuring that they are cultivating environments where their students are supported, they are, I think, entitled to engage in counter speech, even if they have to permit people to come to their campuses and make speeches about things that students might find offensive, that might even contradict their stated institutional values. They might, right, be encouraged, even required to allow that speech. That doesn't mean that they can't engage in counter speech. That is, in fact, what we encourage as a matter of free speech. And so I think that, again, we critique what happened in that instance, although it is completely consistent with what we have always said is the appropriate response with respect to free speech.
Jeannie, I'm going to give you a quick follow-up, and then we have only a few minutes. I at least want to put in front of all of us two really easy to answer questions. I say that with sarcasm, they're very deep, but Jeannie, quick.
Just very quickly, I'm all for counter speech. I think that that's definitely many times the answer. And I would be more sympathetic to your characterization of the Stanford incident if in fact the judge had been able to speak and there was also counter speech. But because the incident was that it was shut down and there was no speech, it wasn't an issue of speech and counter speech in that instance.
So I'm going to save both of these questions. We have like 30 seconds to a minute for each person to speak to one of them, and it's really almost an impossible challenge. But this is what the audience is thinking. The first is...
This is where we earn the wine that you promised us for later.
This is exactly it. Can we do it? The first is, how does the digital revolution of information and social media impact this situation? A big part of the chilling effect is not necessarily just what goes on campus with DEI offices, but how everything is recorded, shared, or commented on by the world. There is no private university anymore in the sense, right? It's very public. The second one is a focus on Harvard, but I actually think it's a problem way beyond Harvard. How can we fix the issue of ideological echo chambers on Harvard or other campuses when both the student body and faculty are overwhelmingly left-leaning? Obviously, some universities don't have that, but enough do so that it's a problem. Is there a path forward when there's a lack of conservative diversity on campus? So I'm now going to have you start with you, and I'm going to ask that we really try to limit it to like a minute response to one of these, just because we will be running out of time. Yeah.
And the first one is about...
The digital revolution and the public accessibility to what even goes on in the classroom. Yeah.
So, yeah, like I said, the students are more scared of their peers and what they're going to do on social media than they are of what I'm going to say in the classroom. So one quick strategy that I've started using in my classroom is, on day one, I tell them, you are mandated to disagree. Class participation is very high, and we're going to play a game. I'm going to assess your class participation based on how confused I am about your political viewpoint. So argue, you're mandated. So I should never know. If I actually find out that this is your leaning or this is your viewpoint, you get downgraded. So speak carefully, and you're mandated to disagree. We cannot have a classroom where we won't disagree. So this is just a simple strategy that I've started using, and I've had students report back that they find it incredibly liberating, because no one can go outside and say, so-and-so said this, because they're donning a hat.
I think the one about social media is incredibly important. This is another thing that I think that diversity gets blamed for, and that's cancel culture, right? And cancel culture exists apart from diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And so I think that there is this heightened sense of awareness, there is this heightened sense of accountability, there is this heightened sense of threat, and this heightened sense of kind of punitive action, all surrounding, right, a larger cultural phenomenon that has nothing to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yet it gets laid to blame on diversity, equity, inclusion in part, and I just think that that's an unfair assessment.
Thanks. Ilya.
On the digital point, I'll just defer to Jonathan Haidt's work. His Substack has been previewing his book on the psychology of all of this, which is in part a sequel to his and Greg Lukianoff's The Coddling of the American Mind, and Greg has his own sequel with the Cancellation of the American Mind. But he's done fascinating work about how the rise of social media, what that has on higher ed and otherwise. On the second bit, I would say in terms of reform proposals, and Jeannie's colleague Steve Pinker has written a lot about that and how to reform Harvard and whatnot, but this does go more broadly. I would just add the Chicago trifecta, right? In addition to the free speech principles, there's the Shills report, which is non-ideological hiring of faculty, and the Calvin report, which is institutional neutrality on questions of political controversy.
Thanks, Ilya. Jeannie, last word's yours.
Yeah, on social media, we can't solve everything, and surely there are things that, as Stacey says, DEI offices are not responsible for. But on the social media front, I will say that at Harvard Law School, we have an actual rule that binds every person in the classroom that you cannot actually report out what happened in a class discussion in a way that it would be possible to identify the person who made the comment. So while you might be able to generally characterize something and complain about it on social media, you cannot sort of like direct people's ire to an individual, a specific person, or make it like possible for people to figure out who it is. I think that helps, and it doesn't solve everything, but we can think about creative ways like that to make it feel more safe and inclusive in the classroom.
I'm going to invite Eric up here to give the closing thoughts on this.
Before I thank our wonderful panelists and moderator, I want to encourage students here and students online to continue discussion at dinner. If you're a first year at Annenberg, there'll be a place for you to discuss this further, and at many of the houses as well. So that's the first thing. I know that in the Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership, we often show a chart of the ideal discussion. And it's not a cold discussion like outdoors today. It's simmering. And I want to thank the panelists for, at various points, in deep and probative ways, offering a simmering discussion of a really important issue. Thank you so much to you and to Chris for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.